Hi again. I'd like to turn our attention to Chapter 10, which is really looking at where our lineage starts. So, last chapter we looked at primates, and there's a lot of primates still around, adapted to different environments all over the world. But our line, where humans come from, finds its roots in one of these branches. And so that's what we'd like to turn our attention to today. As I mentioned before, we're apes. We are amongst the group that we call hominoids, and those include other apes. And I think I mentioned at some point in the past that there was a question in the 19th century when Charles Darwin was first coming up with some of these theories of evolution as to where we find our ancestors. We've already discussed that the Central America, South America were eliminated from the running of possibilities of where our ancestors could be found because those are platyrrhines and we're catarrhines. And so the dental formation alone tells us that that is not where our ancestors can be found. That is a branch that split off in another direction before our branch started to develop. So somewhere in the so-called Old World, which includes Eurasia and Africa, is where we should be looking. But in the 19th century, they didn't have DNA. They didn't have the ability to do these scientific analyses of some of our genetic relationships with other animals that lived, and now we know that chimpanzees and bonobos, which live in Africa, are our closest relatives. But for some time in the 19th century, there were proponents that Asia was where we should be looking to. For what it's worth, Charles Darwin was correct. He was a strong supporter of the African hypothesis that we found our ancestors there, but others thought that maybe orangutans were our closest relatives and that we split from a common ancestor with them in Asia someplace. We'll come back to that next chapter when we start looking at Homo erectus. There's an interesting sort of side story about those early days of trying to find human ancestors in Asia. But as it turns out, it is Africa that we really should be looking. And that should make sense because of last chapter we saw that the hominoids started to appear in Africa, and although they spread into Asia and into Europe, it was really the heartland of ape development was in Africa. And we saw that in the Fayum, in Egypt, was a hotspot, a place where early primate development in Africa, the split of several different branches. We saw the platyrrhines split from the catarrhines. We saw the haplorhines and the strepsirrhines start to split. And we saw the beginning of the hominoids with Ardipithecus and others that started to develop. And that's a great sequence. You know, that is a buildup of time that the Fayum has been eroded away, and scientists can go and see it from the side, and the fossil record is there preserved. But the environment changed, and what was once a lush, forested, swampy area that is now the Fayum desert started to change, and that lush environment went away, which means that the animals that were living there had to move or had to adapt. And so we lose that sequence in the Fayum after a certain time, and we have to pick it up someplace else. And the next hotspot I'm going to talk about quite a bit is the Olduvai Gorge. This is, and in fact, it's the entire Great Rift Valley, which runs the entire length of East Africa, and it's sort of the Grand Canyon of Africa. And it has many locations in many countries, and it's such an important area for for the history of humans, or the paleoanthropology of humans, that we're going to come back to it over and over and over again. It's great source of information, but as I've mentioned before in chapter 8, these hotspots are terrific for getting information, but they're they make us rely on those hotspots. And is there any information outside of those hotspots that we can find that actually adds to our information? Well, we're going to see that yes, there are some other locations that have been found, but we don't have as much information from them, and so the picture is building. And most of what we have relies upon this one sequence and some bits and pieces from various other places. But it is building up a picture that seems pretty clear, although I will point out in this chapter where some ambiguities still lie and where we need more information. So any discussion of paleoanthropology can't really be complete without mentioning the Leakeys. It's a dynastic family. Mary and Louis Leakey were paleoanthropologist pioneers in the field who really got a lot of this interest in the Olduvai Gorge, particularly in Tanzania, where they worked. It was their main location of work, and then Maeve and Richard Leakey, their children and children-in-law, also carried on their legacy as well. So that's why I call it a dynasty. They're a scientific family that really changed the way that we look at human evolution, and really are sort of the founding parents of paleoanthropology. Although there's many other big names that are involved as well. The thing that they're very important for is elaborating a particular type of species of animal that we call the Australopithecines, or Australopithecus, which is a genus. And if you look at your taxonomy, that's not a species, which means that being a genus, Australopithecine or Australopithecus, has multiple species within it. And this is something that was a little misunderstood in the early days. We thought that when we found a fossil species that was neither chimpanzee-like nor human-like, we thought it was one of our relatives, one of our ancestors. But as we've seen from watching the video on living primates, you've got many different species that live contemporaneously, living right on top of one another in the same forests, and there's no reason to assume that that was not the same case in the past. And so some of these pre-human ancestors of ours are not actually our ancestors. They were our competitors. They come from a same common ancestor. Some of them were successful in certain ways and found certain survival strategies, and others found other survival strategies. One of those is going to be our ancestor, but the other ones are going to be part of the picture of the past, but they will also be not necessarily directly related to us as an ancestor species. So the Olduvai Gorge dates the bed 1 or stratum 1 dates to about 1.8 million years ago, and this is done from potassium argon dating, which we covered in chapter 8. And bed 1 contains Australopithecus, but also the earliest member of our own genus, Homo habilis. So the reason why I'm bringing this up right now is because, once again, we're trying to look at these relationships through time, the evolutionary sequence. And so that shows that Australopithecus is earlier than, but then overlaps with our genus, Homo. We're Homo sapiens, and the first Homo, the earliest Homo that we know of, is Homo habilis. So this sequence in Olduvai Gorge actually shows us our ancestor species evolving into human species, Homo species. So this is very important for trying to trace how, when, why, and where humans evolved. So in order to identify what we're talking about when we see these fossils in the record and what we're trying to look for, let's remind ourselves of what we saw in a much earlier chapter about defining what a human is. What is a human? Well, upright walking. non-honing canines, having some kind of tool usage, material culture, speech. We have speech. There's cooperative hunting, and there is domestication of plants and animals. Now, the first two of those, upright walking and non-honing canines, are both purely physiological. Those are physiological adaptations to environmental natural selection pressures. And we'll look at how that takes place. The other ones relate to the brain, which is also a physiological transformation. We started to get bigger brains, but that allowed us to do something that is not just physiological. We started to use our brains to manipulate the environment to change it in our favor. And by the last one, domestication of plants and animals, we were creating entire environments, entire landscapes, entire virtual worlds around us. And that is the last stage that's brought up in this book, because really that set the ball rolling for the past 10,000 years of us transforming our communities into not just responding to nature's cues, but actually making new ones ourselves, changing the environment to suit ourselves. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was a good thing that happened, but it is part of our uniqueness. It's something that only humans are really doing that. So what we want to do is look for the clues in the fossil record in the past that tell us about what makes us different, what makes humans different from other hominins. And once again, like having a Mercedes-Benz from 1955 and one from 2005, there's going to be some stages along the way. We didn't just overnight go from an ape into a human. There are stages. And so your book lays this out in the order that it does, with these things that identify us as humans: upright walking, non-honing canines, in this order, because that's how chronologically we will find them. Now, that's putting the cart before the horse a little bit, but it makes sense to do it this way. So we're going to see that upright walking was the first thing that we find in the fossil record that our ancestors started to do. And so all of those other things weren't present. So they still had honing canines. They didn't have material culture or use tools. They didn't have speech or cooperative hunting or domestication. None of those things existed. They didn't even really have particularly big brains, but they started to stand up. And that's evident in the fossil record, as we'll come to in a moment. And each of these things incrementally starts to get introduced. And so not long after the first standing apes, you started to get the reduction in the canines. And that is probably evident of a diet change. Then you start to get the brain selected for doing things like creating material culture, and then speech and hunting and domestication of plants and animals as we go along. But we'll come to those a little bit later. So how do we identify these features? Well, the first couple of them are pretty easy because they're physiological. So we can look to the fossil record, and we can try and find signs of bipedalism. So how do you find that out? I've talked previously about the foramen magnum, where the spine meets the skull, and it's very difficult if I'm on all fours, or even if I'm knuckle walking, for me to even look forward. If I have to strain my neck even to look forward, and I certainly can't look up in that position. No, my posture is aligned with an adaptation of where my head meets my spine vertically at a perpendicular angle, not at an angle like that for a knuckle walker, and certainly not like that for a monkey that walks along the top of trees as a quadruped. No, my and your foramen magnum, the hole at the base of your skull, joins your spine that way, which means that you are positioned that way as an adaptation, a physiological adaptation to walking on 2 feet. But thankfully, that's not the only place where it shows up, because we can't control whether you find that tiny little fragment of the hole at the base of the skull. You might find some other fragment of a fossil, but there's at least 7 places on the human body, or the physical body, that have traces of bipedalism. So the foramen magnum, as I've mentioned, but also the spine is oriented not in a C shape or a flattened arc like you get in quadrupedal or knuckle walkers. Ours has an S-shaped curve with the base right on top of the spine, or on the top. So your head is right above the base of the spine, but with a bend in it that actually provides a little bit of shock absorption for all that weight as it's oriented downwards. So your spine is adapted to that posture as well. So if you find that a spine connects in that S-shaped curve, that's also indicative of a bipedal creature. Also, the hips are taking a lot of weight, and their motion, their muscles attached to the hips in a particular way, which means that for a knuckle walker, they have the pelvis is taller, and on a knuckle walker like a gorilla, and ours is shorter. It's less elongated because we have a different sort of motion, and our muscles attach in a different way for a different type of locomotion. Also, our legs are longer because we are taking longer strides. We also have shorter forelimbs proportionally to our legs. Also, because the weight of your body is coming down onto your legs, rather than splaying out, sort of like a pigeon toe, our knees come together to actually provide more support for that. So the knees are another location where you can find the evidence for bipedalism. And then finally, all of this weight rests on your feet. And rather than a monkey or an ape that has grasping ability to hold on to things with your feet to pick up apples and eat them, I hope you're not able to do that with your feet. No, we have specially adapted feet for taking all of that weight, that we're no longer able to grasp with our feet because they're specialized for another purpose. Although they have an ancestral history in being able to grasp, which is why we still have toes and things like that. Our bones and our bone structure has a double arch, which provides a shock absorption for all of that weight that rests on our feet. And so if you find evidence of any of these bits of fossils, you can actually see the transitions from being a knuckle walker or quadrupedal into a bipedal animal like we are. So that's some of the things that we'll want to be looking for. Also, the other physiological change that starts to take place is, and that's very important and occurs just after bipedalism, is non-hominin canines. Now, gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos all have long fangs on their teeth, these canines in the front. They grow throughout their life, and they sharpen. And these are for slicing. And you can see this by observing gorillas or chimpanzees in the wild, and you can see that they use them to slice fruits and slice vegetation. So they're for slicing. They're like knives. And they grow throughout the lifespan of the animal, and they fit into a V-shaped gap in between their lower teeth called the diastema, that every time they close their mouth, those canines, upper canines, fit into the diastema and sharpen, just like you'd get when you sharpen a knife. And we don't have that. Your canines stop growing. You have canines, but they've become reduced in size. They're no bigger than any of your other teeth, and they also don't grow throughout your lifetime, and they don't get sharper. We don't use them for slicing fruit anymore. Also, because the canines and the diastema of a chimpanzee or a bonobo or gorilla go into their tooth, they come in at sort of an arced angle. And so we don't do that. Our teeth close at an apical angle. So our teeth come down like this, and that's for a different type of chewing. So we are grinding rather than shearing our food. Also, as I've mentioned before, even though your teeth are primarily for eating, once you have a set of tools, you can use them for other things. So I've said it before, we have stereoscopic vision and color vision, and that allows you to watch Netflix or this video that you're watching right now. But that's not the purpose of your eyes. Your purpose of your eyes is for your survival. And but once you have them, you can use them for whatever you like. You can use them to drive a car. You can use them to watch a video. You can use it for other purposes. And the same thing goes for canines. These strong canines in chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas. So big, long canines are for particular type of diet, but once you have them, you can use them to do things like be more aggressive towards other males, which might give you the advantage when in sexual selection. Also, you not just intimidating males, but impressing females with your long canines. And so we see this behavior in contemporary primates, and when we lose those teeth, our ancestors lost those canines, we can also assume that we lost some of this behavior that's associated with them as well. So even though we can't go back in time to observe our ancestors, when we lose our honing canines, we're also probably losing the behavior of having single male, multiple female partners and male-male aggression. We're probably shifting more towards monogamy or for group survival. And humans tend to pair bond more than apes. So that seems to make sense. Another aspect of the teeth that I'd like to mention is that it's not just the canines that the canines are lost. We're also adding something as well. So as we see the loss of the canines, we start to get thicker enamel. And enamel is an expensive thing that your body creates, and you don't really, your body doesn't create something that it doesn't need. And so why do we have thicker enamel than chimpanzees? Well, because of our diet. Our diet is changing from shearing softer vegetal things and fruits to crushing and grinding harder shelled seeds and grasses and things like that. Our ancestors started to change their diet,